Hello, everyone, the audience and also online. My name is Jan Bachmann. I'm a PhD student at the Network and Equality Group. And today I have the pleasure to host Benjamin Rosche for a talk in our one installment in our lecture series on network inequality. Ben has a PhD, if I'm informed correctly, from the Department of Sociology at Cornell University. And he's also a member of the Socioeconomic lab. And very, very recently, he started a postdoc in the Office of Population Research at Princeton University. Please, Ben, correct me if I'm wrong on this one.
Yeah.
His research is on the analysis of family and dynamics as drivers for social inequality. And today, as you can see already, his talk is going to be about socioeconomic segregation and adolescent friendship networks. So please, Ben, take it away. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for the introduction and thanks for inviting me to the speaker series. I'm really excited to be able to present this work here today on socioeconomic segregation in adolescent friendship networks, in particular in US high schools. And so if you have any clarification questions, please just interrupt me. You can raise your hand or just start talking. I'm happy to answer questions also in between the talk. Okay, so I would like to start with showing you friendship networks in US high schools. So here you just see one bigger component of a friendship network in a smaller school in the northeastern United States. It's plotted here 3 times. And it might not be a surprise to you that friendship networks don't form at random, but they show segregation patterns. And here on the left-hand side, you see that this friendship network, this component, is segregated by gender. In the middle, you can see that it is also segregated by race. And then on the right hand, you see that it is potentially also segregated by socioeconomic status. And while the first 2 types of segregation have received enormous attention in the literature, socioeconomic segregation has received comparatively less attention. And this is probably also because the effects that you find are mixed. Some find positive effects, others find no effects. And so you can imagine that a lot of those studies that were planned and then found no effects were never published. And so there's probably a sort of a publication bias there. Okay, and so today I'm going to tackle 2 questions. The first one is, how SES segregated are high school friendship networks? And the second one is, what are the drivers of this segregation? And then with respect to the first question, there's a little bit of a debate in the literature, because quite recently, Chetty and colleagues have published in Nature a paper in which they find substantial evidence for SES segregation. They use Facebook friendships and they measure socioeconomic segregation at a dyad level by kind of measuring the absence of ties between low and high SES students. And that's kind of surprising because the prior sociological literature on this topic, which Chetty and colleagues, by the way, don't cite at all, find no or very small effects. And they use different data sources. They use AdHealth, Prosper, or GSS, which are all surveys that include a network component in which basically students were asked to nominate their 10 best friends. And so the data differs, and not only the data, but also the measurement. They measure socioeconomic segregation as the absolute SES distance of friends, and then kind of find evidence for socioeconomic segregation if this distance is very small, smaller than expected. And then with respect to the drivers, so the second question, we have basically a well-established literature on the determinants of racial segregation. And this literature highlights 2 things. On the one hand, structural barriers that drive segregation in friendship networks. So basically, if kids select or are selected into neighborhood courses and extracurricular activities, and this varies by race or socioeconomic background, then even in the absence of explicit preferences for kind of same SES or same race friendships, you would still expect segregated friendship networks by sheer proximity. If they just like select into the same social foci, then they're more likely to become friends, even if they don't necessarily have a preference for it. But then, of course, there are preferences. And so intentional and unintentional boundary making between groups with intersecting attributes is something that the sociological literature has examined quite intensively. A problem with these studies is that they often focus on different potential determinants, but then they omit measures of alternatives that may confound their results. And this is maybe also to a certain extent true to mathematical and agent-based models that I see also coming out of the Complexity Science Hub, where like specific mechanisms are focused on, and then basically a generative sufficiency is demonstrated. But then, of course, the question is, what about alternative explanations and how to rule them out? And so what I'm going to do in this study is, or also showing this talk, is I kind of like comprehensively disentangle the different determinants of socioeconomic segregation, which to date are still uninvestigated. So it's kind of a horse race kind of study. What are the biggest determinants of among them? Okay, and so let's go first to part one, how SES segregated are adolescent friendship networks. I'm first gonna preview the results, and then I'm gonna show how I got there. Okay, so what I find is that SES segregation is characterized by an exclusion of students at the bottom and enclosure among students at the top of the SES distribution. I also find that the exclusion of low-SES students from high-SES cliques is as pronounced as racial segregation, while other types of socioeconomic segregation are much lower than racial segregation, but this type is just as pronounced. And then another difference to racial segregation is that socioeconomic segregation is asymmetric. And then lastly, I'll show that the conflicting results in the literature are due to measurement and interpretation differences rather than differences in data. Okay, so how do I get there? I use data from AdHealth, which many of you might know. It's a nationally representative sample of adolescents in grades 7 to 12 during the 1995 school year. It includes more than 83,000 students in 128 schools. And these schools include public and private schools that vary by size, location, and composition. And as part of AdHealth, students were asked to identify up to 10 best friends in school. And then my key explanatory variable is SES background, which is a continuous index based on parental education, occupation, and income. So it's a composite index. There's two issues with AdHealth, and I'm going to tackle both. So the first one is that there's lots of missing data, and I use multiple imputation to impute missing nodal features, as well as a pretty comprehensive exponential random graph model to impute missing edges. And the reason why I do this is because I also want to see to what degree basically specific network endogenous processes play a role in socioeconomic segregation. And for that, it is really important that I don't systematically observe wrong network structures. And if now selective parts are missing of the network, then this might give me a very wrong idea of which endogenous processes in the network are actually happening. And that's why I kind of use the best information available to kind of construct full networks, even though, of course, there's a little bit of noise in it because of the imputation. And then the second thing is that AdHealth is not self-weighting. It's a sample that oversampled quite drastically African Americans, for instance, and undersampled other students. And I want to get to representative measures of socioeconomic segregation. And so one of the things that I do is I weigh the diets by their inclusion probability, which is just the product of the sample weights of ego and outer. Okay. And to measure socioeconomic segregation, I'm looking at a dyadic measure of segregation, and I want to basically check whether interaction patterns differ between different points in the SES distribution. And to do that, I basically categorize students in low, medium, and high SES at the tercile cutoff points. And then I basically examine the socioeconomic mixing matrix, which is basically all possible combinations, as you can see here. So ties among low SES students, for instance, are same SES ties, or ties between low and high SES students would be an example for cross SES ties. And what I then do is I basically just count the number of observed ties in the socioeconomic mixing matrix, and then I compare it to a baseline. And my baseline is random networks with the same degree distribution as the observed networks. And then I basically just count the number of same and cross SES ties in these random networks as well, which is kind of like the baseline if students selected friends at random, basically. And then my measure of socioeconomic segregation, which is really available for each of these types of ties, I measure how many fewer or more of each of these ties do we observe than we would expect if friends selected at random. And these are the results. So here on the y-axis, you see the segregation measure S, and then on the x-axis, you see the different types of ties. And now let's have a look, for instance, at all the nominations from low SES students. So what we can see is that low SES students select other low SES students about 5% more often than expected, and high SES students about 8% less likely than expected. So low SES students are not particularly selective when it comes to the SES background of their peers. When we look at medium SES students, we can see that they are not more likely to select other medium SES peers, but they are less likely to select low SES peers because they are more likely to select high SES peers. And the most selective with respect to socioeconomic background are high SES students. As you can see here, they are much more likely to select other high SES peers as friends, not because they are not interested in befriending medium SES peers, but because they try to avoid ties to low SES peers. So what we can see here, I'm going to discuss these results now a little bit in context, is one sec. Yeah, what we can see here is that there's somewhat of a unilateral exclusion, because it's basically both high and medium SES students that do not want to be friends with low SES students, but low SES students don't reciprocate this very much. And this shows some strong differences with racial segregation. So on the one hand, I want to say that like overall socioeconomic segregation is much lower than racial segregation. But for one type of tie, so the tie from high SES to low SES, within schools, it is 18% less likely. And that compares to interracial friendships on average, which are within schools 20% less likely. So you can say that there's this one particular type of tie that has just a very strong boundary. And then the other thing, and this is really important, is as you saw, the low SES students are not very unlikely to nominate high SES students, but high SES students are very unlikely to nominate low SES students. And if you calculate these differences by tie direction now, and do this for all types of ties, then you will find that on average, when it comes to socioeconomic segregation, there's a 16 percentage point difference in tie direction. And if you do the same thing with the racial mixing matrix, so if you do white black versus black white, white Asian versus Asian white, and then average across all of them, you'll find that it's only 1 percentage point different. So it's pretty clear that basically socioeconomic segregation is unilateral exclusion, while racial segregation is mutual exclusion. There's kind of in the patterning, it's very different. Then the second thing that I find, so I wanted to understand why is it that Chetty and colleagues find more evidence for socioeconomic segregation. They calculate an economic connectedness index, which is 0.89, and this can be interpreted as low-SES students have 11 percent fewer than expected ties to high-SES students. What I did is I just replicated their analysis on AdHealth to see whether AdHealth is more or less segregated than the Facebook data. And what I find is that the economic connectedness value is 0.86, which means lower SES students have 14% fewer than expected ties to high SES students. And that means friendship networks in AdHealth are more segregated than the friendship networks on Facebook, which kind of rules out this idea that maybe the Facebook friendships are just naturally more segregated, and that's why Chetty and colleagues find more evidence for socioeconomic segregation than the prior sociological literature that has used mostly AdHealth. So that's not the case, but I can tell you what the case is. So what sociologists have used is the absolute SES distance measure. And if you think about this measure, this is just not a very good measure to pick up the specific unilateral and nonlinear segregation pattern that I just showed you. Because first of all, it averages across tie direction because of the absolute value, kind of doesn't matter in which direction. But as we saw, the directionality in socioeconomic segregation matters quite a bit. And so this measure just averages this value, these values. And then the second thing is it's also nonlinear in the sense that basically, for instance, ties between low and medium SES students are less likely, but then ties between medium and high SES students are more likely. And for an absolute distance measure, these distances are the same. So as you can see, because it kind of imposes this linear effect, if you now have a nonlinear form of segregation, then again, it will be averaged. And so that's why kind of the sociological literature wasn't able to find it with this crude measure. Okay, so this is the end of part one. Just in case anyone has any questions, I could take questions now. Otherwise, I would go on to the drivers of socioeconomic segregation. There's a question.
Okay. So I have some questions about the main results that you showed up. I think
these ones
before. Yeah. So here, can you talk about the measurement here? Is it the instances, the number of instances of each mentioned in the form, or?
Yeah. So basically, it is the ratio of how many we actually observe divided by how many we would expect.
And the expectation
comes from random networks. I basically simulated random networks with the same out degree distribution and just counted how many of those types of ties I would see there.
I see. Thank you.
That was a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
I have a question slash comment. So just to put in context the next slide where you compare your results with Chetty, right? So does this mean, or will it make sense that in Facebook, the networks are less segregated because you can reach more people out of your bubble, which is the school? So this means that, okay.
Yeah, so this is kind of a side result that speaks a little bit to this discussion about like online versus offline networks. Here you see that basically the offline networks are more segregated than the online networks, which is in line with other literature on this topic. Yeah, okay. So now part two, what drives SES segregation? I'm gonna preview the results again, and then I'll show you how I get there. So I find that disparities in the socioeconomic composition between schools account for about 50% of the total socioeconomic segregation, while trending bias within school accounts for another 50%. I also find that within schools, SES segregation is shaped largely by stratified courses, as well as students' racial and socioeconomic preferences. There is some evidence that social and socioeconomic status overlap, that basically the high SES kids are also the popular kids. And lastly, and this is kind of a very interesting result, relational mechanisms like triadic closure and reciprocity, they are often in the literature described as mechanisms, endogenous mechanisms that kind of amplify segregation. And I do find that they increase clustering, but they only have minor effects on school-wide SES segregation. Okay, let's see. So let's first talk about like what are the potential drivers of socioeconomic segregation in friendship networks, just theoretically, conceptually speaking. Well, the biggest single one is systematic SES disparities in or disparities in the SES composition between schools that lead to between school segregation. Then also within school, you can have segregation, not only because of preferences, but also because of basically structural barriers, stratified settings in which kind of kids select into courses, extracurriculars, and neighborhoods. And if this is based on their SES background, then this will induce socioeconomic segregation. Second, homophily. And so I'm using homophily now not as the outcome, to describe the outcome of socioeconomic segregation, but more as a human tendency conditional on everything else, basically. And so crucially, not only so the relational mechanisms basically reflect tendencies that we not only look at, let's say, our peers' features, but also at the existing network. We incorporate the existing ties into our decision-making process as to whether we want to be friends with somebody. And so reciprocity is basically the idea that if I nominate someone as friend, then this peer might be more likely to reciprocate this friendship. And triadic closure means that if I'm not friends with somebody, but I have a shared friend with him, then we might be inclined to become friends because we have the shared friendship. Okay, and so what I'm going to do first is I will disentangle basically how much of the total socioeconomic segregation is between schools and how much is within schools. And I do this by, again, starting with a random networks. I simulate random networks with the same out-degree distribution as the observed networks, where students can select friends at random, but not only within their schools, but also between all schools, across schools. It's kind of like a perfect world in which there is no disparities between schools and complete random selection of friends. And this kind of gives us an idea for each type of tie, basically, what's the proportion that we would expect in an ideal world. And then I run another model where I let students select friends at random, but only within their own schools. So I retain the SES disparities between schools. And then lastly, we have the observed value. And basically the differences. So here we have basically a 5% difference here and a 5% difference here. This is tells you how much we lose between schools and within schools. It's kind of, it decomposes within and between school segregation. And so now I'll go back one more time to our graph. And here, the patterned bars basically show you how much of the total segregation you see is within schools and how much of it is between schools. And you can find that for low SES kids, the small selective tendencies that we see are largely between schools. So basically, this is not even their own choices. It is just, it relates to the composition, the differences in the composition between schools. For medium SES students, however, because they are kind of like, some of them will be in schools with largely high SES kids, some of them will be in schools with largely low SES kids. So for them, it really their choices matter quite a bit. And this is what you see here, that like the segregating tendencies they really happen within schools. And then for high SES students, you see that it is really a mixture of both. Basically, both between school segregation and within school segregation determines this outcome. And there is a lot of within school segregation because like when I talk to Americans and tell them about socioeconomic segregation, and I would let them draw how much of the total socioeconomic segregation would be between schools, most people would put this like at like 90% or higher. People have this feeling that it's largely between schools, but this is not true. As you can see here, there's a sizable within school component. Okay, and now the interesting part for the last step within schools, I would like to understand how much of it is because of stratified settings, homophily, popularity differences in relational mechanisms. And for that, I use an exponential random graph model in which I operationalize all these ideas, basically. And then I estimate a full model to understand how much of these mechanisms, how much they impact friendship formation. And then I basically start with a random network, and then I toggle on these estimated effects and simulate networks at each step in which each mechanism was turned on one by one. And in each of these simulations, I mean, it's always hundreds of thousands of simulated networks, and I average across them. But in each of these networks, I basically examine how socioeconomic segregation changes. And yeah, I thought maybe it might be nice to quickly talk about exponential random graph models here, because not everybody might know about them, and they're kind of cool models, and I actually like to advertise them. So these models are basically, it's almost like a form of logistic regression, but it models not as like the existence of one tie only, but which you would do with a logistic model, but the combination of ties, basically the entire network. And it models it in terms of local tie configurations that then correspond to model parameters, and these parameters are then being estimated. And so I'll just show you here examples of these parameters. So you can, for instance, add into this model, let's say, reciprocated ties. And what it then does is it kind of like measures in a network how many more of these reciprocated ties do we see than we would expect. And then you can add all sorts of configurations that you find relevant. And that's what I did in this exponential random graph model. And then I estimated basically how much conditional on each other, how much each of these configurations adds to the overall structure of the network. And so, yeah, as I said, it's kind of comparable to logistic regression, with the difference that it's actually more like conditional logistic regression, because like it models the existence of a tie given the rest of the network, like everything else but this type of tie. And rather than using kind of like conventional covariates, it uses these so-called change statistics, or network configurations that are kind of functions of the network and the features of the nodes. And it kind of like estimates these effects by kind of trying to understand what happens if you add one of these configurations as compared to if it wouldn't be there. Basically, this is kind of like the intuition of what an ergon does in the background. And here I'll just show you, I'm not going to go over it. This is my comprehensive friendship formation model, in which I have like operationalized all these kinds of ideas of like how friendship formation happens in these high school networks. And many of them are significant, some of them are not, but I just use it as a predictive model and then kind of toggle on these effects, simulate, it's a generative model, so I simulate networks from it and then measure the segregation in these networks. And this is the result that we get. And this is almost the last slide, so we're almost done. It's kind of a complex graph, but I would like to explain it to you. So basically, this bar chart shows you the effect of each mechanism on socioeconomic segregation. And if the bars go up, then it means it increases segregation. If they go down, it means it decreases segregation. And so the way I measure segregation is on the dyad level, right? And so that's why you see these different colors. That's why it's a stacked bar chart. And for each of these ties, like segregation means something else. So for instance, if a mechanism produces more ties among low-SES students, that will increase segregation as compared to if it produces less of them, it would decrease segregation. But for ties among between low and high-SES students, it's the other way around. We want more of those, so that would decrease segregation. If we have less of those, it would increase segregation. And I kind of always flipped the bars in the right direction to measure basically how much each mechanism reduces the right or wrong kinds of ties. And what I then do is at the very bottom, you just see the proportion of the overall changes that you see. So how much does neighborhoods change socioeconomic segregation overall? And what we see here is that neighborhoods, and so this is not between school neighborhoods, right? This is kind of like how much neighborhoods impact socioeconomic segregation in the same school. So this is kind of like a bus stop effect. If you take the same bus to school, are you more likely to become friends? And if so, does this add something to socioeconomic segregation? And the answer is not very much. But what we see is that stratified courses significantly impact socioeconomic segregation. Extracurricular activities, by contrast, have a very ambivalent effect. And it kind of makes sense if you think about it. So it kind of increases some types of ties, but decreases others. So it kind of like, if with some types of sports and clubs, you see more mixing in them versus for other types of sports and clubs, you actually see less mixing. And so the impact is really ambivalent, and overall it reduces socioeconomic segregation somewhat, but it could do a better job basically. And then when we look at homophily, so these residual tendencies to become friends with the same GPA, same race, and same SES, we see that GPA doesn't matter so much, but racial homophily strongly impacts socioeconomic segregation because race and SES are so correlated. And then, of course, also socioeconomic homophily, so residual tendencies controlling for everything else. You still see students being more likely to be friends with other peers from the same SES background, and that also increases socioeconomic segregation. Then when we look at popularity differences, we don't see much effects for GPA and race, but for socioeconomic background, we see a strong effect, but it actually decreases segregation. And it also makes sense if you think about it, because what you find in the friendship formation model is basically that high SES kids are more popular, and they are the most popular. So everyone tries to be friends with the high SES kids. And that's kind of like showing that the socioeconomic and social status overlaps in high school friendship networks, but it just means that it nudges kids from low and medium SES backgrounds to be friends with high SES peers, right? So it kind of motivates them to reach out to them and nominate them. And so it actually creates cross SES friendships. And whether these are real cross SES friendships in the sense that a lot of them are actually not reciprocated by high SES students is questionable, but you can see that this effect is definitely ambivalent. And then lastly, what you can see here with the relational mechanisms, similar to extracurricular activities, they are ambivalent. So they increase some types across SES friendships, but they also decrease them. And the same goes with triadic closure. And so overall, they don't actually change socioeconomic segregation too much. Okay, and now I'm coming to my conclusion. Socioeconomic segregation is characterized by unilateral exclusion of students at the bottom and closure among students at the top of the SES distribution. Within and between school processes affect SES segregation in a 50-50 ratio. Within schools, SES segregation is shaped by stratified courses and students' racial and SES preferences, in particular racial homophily. And relational mechanisms have only minor effects on SES segregation. And I try to kind of derive policy implications from these results. And these are my policy implications. I think we should, intervention should focus on the friending behavior of students in the upper half of the SES distribution, because they drive socioeconomic segregation. In the lower half, they don't actually have very strong socioeconomic preferences. Then eliminating academic tracking will likely decrease socioeconomic segregation in friendship networks, because courses add so much to socioeconomic segregation. And then low SES students should be enabled and encouraged to participate in extracurriculars, because that would kind of tilt the effect of extracurricular activities to be more integrating, because right now it's such that like a lot of low SES students actually don't even participate in them, and hence these groups just recreate the segregation that already exists in school. And then lastly, SES integrated friendship networks, at least in the United States, will be difficult to achieve without also addressing racial segregation. And that's it.
Thank you, Ben.